Have you ever felt like you're fighting something inside of yourself? As if there were a dark, silent side that insists on appearing in the worst moments, even when you try to hide it. That part that you avoid, repress, or pretend doesn't exist, it has a name. And it is not just there by chance. Carl Jung, one of the greatest thinkers in modern psychology, called this the shadow. But be careful, what you don't face controls you. Shadow is not just a philosophical concept. It's real. It's present in your impulses that you don't understand, in your feelings that you try to ignore, and in reactions that you swear aren't part of who you are. Ignoring the shadow is like trying to put out a fire blindfolded. The more you avoid it, the more it grows. But what if I told you that facing this dark side can be precisely the key to your inner freedom? That perhaps true growth lies not in looking strong all the time, but in accepting who you are completely? If this subject has already moved you in the first few seconds, then subscribe to the channel now. Here, we go deep into the ideas that transform lives, without superficiality, without masks. And now, get ready, because in the next few minutes you'll understand why the shadow you hide may be taking control of your life, and what Carl Jung reveals about how to win back that lost power. From a young age, we learn to show only what is accepted. We are praised when we are good, obedient, polite. And without even realizing it, we begin to hide everything that deviates from this pattern. Feelings such as anger, envy, fear, impulses that we deem unacceptable, everything is pushed into a dark corner within us. That corner is the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It just is. What makes it dangerous is precisely the fact that it is ignored. Everything that is repressed does not disappear, on the contrary. It gains strength. It turns into automatic attitudes, reactions that we cannot explain, sabotage that seems to come out of nowhere. Ever wondered why you explode in anger in small situations? Why do you repeat the same patterns in relationships, even though you know they hurt you? Why does it sometimes feel like there's a part of you that sabotages everything when it's about to work out? It is the shadow manifesting. Carl Jung said that the shadow is composed of everything that the ego does not recognize in itself. It's the me you don't want to see, but it is there. And the most curious thing is that the more you deny it, the more it appears. Like a trapped cry that finds creative, and often destructive, ways to make itself heard. And you know what's more unsettling? The shadow feeds on his refusal. It gets stronger every time you say, "That's not me. I'm not like that. I would never do that." And yet it does. Or at least he thinks. Or feels. It is at this moment that many people enter into internal conflict. They think they are failing as human beings. But they are not. They are just living what is human. The truth is that every human being has a shadow. The problem is that few have the courage to look at it. Looking at the shadow requires maturity. It requires a willingness to step out of the role of victim and take responsibility for one's own darkness. And that hurts, because it means admitting that there are parts of us that are not as beautiful nor as noble as we would like to show the world. But here's the most important point. The shadow, when integrated, is not an enemy. She becomes an ally. Behind the aggressiveness, there is strength. Behind the envy, an unfulfilled desire. Behind the shame, a call for acceptance. When you dive into these layers with honesty, something powerful happens. You truly know yourself. And self-knowledge, at this level, transforms everything. You are no longer a hostage to your own impulses. He learns to recognize the triggers, the internal traps, the patterns that previously seemed invisible. He begins to make more conscious decisions. And, most surprisingly, he develops a deep compassion, not only for himself, but also for others. After all, when you understand your own darkness, you also understand the others. And that creates a kind of empathy that's not superficial. It's real. But beware, integrating the shadow is not something that is done overnight. It's a process, a path. And like every real path, it starts with a choice. Stop running away. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about now, how to identify the signs that the shadow is already dominating important aspects of your life without you even realizing it. You may not even see it, but the shadow leaves traces. And if you pay attention to the signs, you will realize that it is more present in your daily life than you think. The first sign is usually repetition. Similar situations which seem to repeat themselves. As a vicious cycle. You leave a troubled relationship and soon enter another one like it. He changes jobs, but conflicts with colleagues or bosses continue. He promises that he will change. But in practice, the same behaviors keep coming back. That's not bad luck. Nor coincidence. It is the shadow in action. It manifests itself precisely in the patterns that you can't break. It's as if, on some unconscious level, you're being led by something outside of your control. And in fact, it is, because whatever you don't accept in yourself acts for you. Another clear sign is emotional intensity. Situations that, rationally, do not justify so much anger, so much sadness, or so much guilt, but that bring you down as if they were the end of the world. In these moments, the reaction is loaded, disproportionate, and is almost always accompanied by that feeling of, I didn't want to do that, I don't know why I acted like that. The truth is that when you don't know where something comes from, it probably comes from the shadow. It also reveals itself in the trials. What you criticize the most in others is usually a mirror of what you deny in yourself. It's uncomfortable, but it's real. Jung said, everything that irritates us in others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. That is, the shadow hides behind the pointed finger. When you feel a compulsive need to correct, criticize, or belittle someone, it's worth asking yourself, what is this showing me about myself? What, exactly, is this attitude trying to protect or hide? Another path where the shadow usually dominates is self-image. The more perfect, controlled, or straight a person tries to look, the greater the chance that they are hiding something much darker. And it's not about evil, it's about humanity. No human being is just light. The problem is that, in an attempt to appear ideal, many people create a persona, a facade that requires an immense effort to maintain. And the longer you live in function of this image, the more distant you become from who you really are. This leads to exhaustion, anxiety, and a constant feeling that something is wrong, even when everything seems to be right. The shadow also appears in procrastination. In all those goals you plan and never accomplish. In the shelved projects. In the promises made in front of the mirror. Because it's often not a lack of ability, it's fear of what might happen if you really go the extra mile. Fear of success, fear of failure, fear of getting out of control. All of this comes from the shadows. And when you don't notice these signs, you live on automatic. He reacts, repeats, sabotages himself, and calls it destiny. But destiny is actually built by the parts of you that you don't yet know. That is why becoming aware of the shadow is so urgent. Because it won't go away if you ignore it. She just hides. And the more hidden, the more it rules your life. Now that you know how it manifests itself, comes the most important question of all. What to do with this information? How do you stop being dominated by the shadow and actually begin to integrate it into your consciousness? That's what we're going to dive into now. Knowing that the shadow exists and realizing how it acts is already a huge step. But the real turning point happens when you decide to face it. Not with strength, not with resistance, but with presence. To integrate the shadow is not to fight against it, it is to welcome it. And here's a truth that few people are willing to face. Shadowing takes emotional courage. It's like voluntarily descending into the most hidden parts of yourself, where traumas, memories, shame, and desires that you've tried to sweep under the rug for years are kept. But Jung was clear. What you resist persists. What you accept is transformed. So, how to do this in practice? The first step is self-observation without judgment. This means being willing to look at your reactions with curiosity rather than criticism. When you feel angry, instead of repressing or blaming yourself, ask, where does it come from? When you feel jealous, investigate, what is this showing me about what I lack or what I want? Every emotion is a clue. Every discomfort, a map. This honesty with oneself is the beginning of liberation, because you stop trying to look perfect and finally start being real. The second step is to accept that you have light and shadow. No human being is above that. Your faults, your fears, your impulses, all are part of your totality. And the more you deny it, the farther you are from your essence. When you embrace your darkness, you begin to discover a force that was previously hidden. The shadow holds valuable resources. That repressed aggressiveness, for example, can turn into assertiveness. Envy can show you which way to go. Vanity can remind you of your worth. Pride can protect your boundaries. What seems like a problem today may be power tomorrow, as long as you accept to look it straight ahead. But this process takes practice. And one of the most powerful tools for this is the emotional mirror. Every time something bothers you in the other, use it as an exercise. Ask yourself, why does this affect me so much? What is this person expressing that, perhaps, I myself do not have the courage to show? This question, asked with sincerity, can open doors that no theory alone is able to open. Another way to integrate the shadow is to allow yourself to express yourself with awareness. Write about how you feel, even if it's ugly, confusing, or uncomfortable. Speak up if you can. Name emotions. Naming is a way of making it conscious. And everything that is conscious can be transformed. And here comes a key point. The shadow does not need to be exposed to the world, but it needs to be recognized by you. Integration is not saying everything you think, nor acting impulsively under the pretext of being authentic. It is knowing that the shadow exists, respecting its existence, but consciously choosing how to act in front of it. That is the real power, not to control everything, but to be aware enough not to be controlled. Throughout this process, you will realize that integrating the shadow is not an end in itself, but a door. As you walk through that door, you begin to access something even deeper, the true self. That which is beyond the ego, beyond the persona, beyond the labels. And that's exactly where we're going to go now. Because, after recognizing and integrating your shadow, comes the most transformative step of all, discovering who you really are when you're no longer running away from yourself. When you begin to integrate the shadow, something silent and profound begins to happen. The persona begins to give way to the true self. That self is the totality of your being. Not just who you would like to be or what you show to the world, but who you really are, with all the lights and all the shadows. For a good part of your life, you live from the persona. It is useful, even necessary. It is through it that you relate socially, play roles, and adapt to the world. But there's a problem. When you believe you your persona, you lose touch with the essence. He begins to live according to expectations, external recognition, validations. And little by little, he disconnects from himself. The integration of the shadow breaks this cycle. It dismantles the illusion of perfection and, at the same time, reveals what has always been there, an authentic, whole self, free from the need to pretend. It is at this moment that the process of individuation, as Jung said, really begins. And what is individuation? It is the path of becoming who you really are. A deep, non-linear process that involves acknowledging all parts of yourself, putting each one in its proper place, and ultimately living with more truth. But this does not mean abandoning everything and living on the margins of social rules. Quite the opposite. It means living with awareness, knowing what comes from your authentic self and what comes from conditioning. That's when you start making choices not to please or correspond, but because they make sense to your soul. And when this connection happens, something powerful is born, a sense of purpose. You stop chasing after things that others say are important and start looking for what really resonates with you. Do you know that feeling of emptiness, even after important achievements? That restlessness that arises even when everything is right? This happens because the persona has been met, but the self continues to be ignored. It is only when you align with your wholeness that you begin to feel a real peace, one that does not depend on external circumstances. At this point, many masks begin to fall. Some relationships change. Some priorities dissolve. And, yes, there can be pain in this process. After all, letting go of old versions of yourself is also a kind of grief. But it is a necessary mourning, because it makes room for the new. You realize that you no longer have to pretend to be safe, because you've learned to deal with vulnerability. That he no longer needs to hide his defects, because he understood that they do not cancel out his value. That you no longer need to seek approval at any cost, because now you know who you are, and that's enough. This authenticity changes everything. Your way of relating, your way of working, your way of living. You start to attract more aligned experiences because you're no longer operating from lack, but from truth. But beware, this path has no end. Individuation is not a point of arrival. It is a continuous movement. There will always be new layers to explore, new shadows to recognize, new parts of yourself to integrate. And that's what makes the journey so rich. The awakening of the self does not mean that the shadow has disappeared. It is still there. But now you know her. You know when it's approaching. And more importantly, he knows how to dialogue with her. And it is precisely at this point, in this balance between light and shadow, between ego and essence, that we begin to find true inner freedom. Now, it's time to understand how this process not only transforms the world inside you, but also begins to profoundly impact the world around you. When you begin to live from the self, something silently, but radically, changes in how you interact with the world. Because what was once an external battlefield now reveals itself as a mirror. You come to realize that many times, the conflict out there is just the reflection of an internal war that is being resolved. This transformation is not only internal, it overflows. What once seemed distant or out of your reach begins to reorganize itself around the new frequency you emit. Relationships gain more depth, or fall apart naturally when they no longer support the truth you carry. And this is not selfishness. It's alignment. You begin to position yourself more clearly, without the need to confront or convince. Firmness comes from the center, not from strength. And it is curious to see how this presence scares some people and attracts others. Because when you become whole, you mirror in others what they are still avoiding seeing in themselves. This is one of the most profound consequences of shadow integration. Your own journey becomes an invitation for others to look at you as well. Not by speech, but by coherence. There is a silent wisdom in those who live with truth. A natural authority that does not need titles, nor approval. And the impact of this is greater than it seems. The integration of the shadow and the awakening of the self do not only create more conscious individuals, they create healthier communities, more humane systems, more honest relationships. Because the healing of an individual reverberates. And this reverberation spreads. A more whole being inspires others to become whole. Imagine a society in which more people looked at their own shadows instead of projecting them onto others. Where empathy comes from the experience of knowing oneself deeply. Where differences were not a reason for attack, but for curiosity. This isn't a distant dream, it's a real possibility, one that starts at the innermost level, you with yourself. And yes, there will still be challenges. The shadow does not disappear. The ego keeps trying to regain control. But now you have tools. You have consciousness. You know that fear, judgment, guilt, and anger no longer need to be absolute truths. They are signs, not sentences. Living with this awareness changes your way of being in the world. You start to act with more intention, speak with more presence, choose more clearly. And little by little, what seemed like a distant ideal, authenticity, balance, inner freedom, begins to become a reality in your daily life. But it is important to remember, this process is not linear. There will be moments of advancement and moments of fall. Phases of expansion and phases of silence. It's all part of it. The important thing is not to abandon the path. Because with each new layer you integrate, a new dimension of yourself is revealed. And it is in this constant movement of going to the bottom and returning to the surface, of descending into the dark to find light, that you become more whole. He takes his place in the world not with imposition, but with truth. Now that you understand the power of integrating the shadow and awakening to the self, we come to the most important moment of all, the completion of this journey. Not as an endpoint, but as a new beginning. An invitation to live more consciously, more fully, more truly. And that's exactly what we're going to explore next. How to apply everything that has been revealed so far in your practical and everyday life, transforming knowledge into action and awareness into presence. We have reached the end of this journey, but as you may have already noticed, this end is not an end point. It is a turning point, because from the moment you start to see your shadow, life changes. The illusion of control gives way to consciousness. The search for perfection dissolves before the truth, and the persona, once so rigid, begins to give space for the self to emerge. You are not just your qualities. It's not just the part that shows on networks, in social gatherings, or in professional achievements. You are a complex whole, made up of contradictions, lights, flaws, hidden powers, and all of this is part of who you are. Integrating these parts does not weaken you. On the contrary, it gives you depth. It gives you freedom. The shadow is not the enemy. It is an invitation, a portal to real self-knowledge. That which you reject in itself may actually be holding the key to your authenticity, for your creativity, for your inner strength. And along this journey, we have seen that to escape from the shadow is to remain imprisoned. To pretend that it does not exist is to give it the power to rule your life silently and unconsciously. But looking at it with courage and presence is what allows you to take the reins of your own path. With each denied emotion that is welcomed, with each judgment transformed into self-investigation, with each mask removed with honesty, you will free yourself. He stops living according to expectations and begins to live according to his truth. This is the true awakening. Not to become something new, but to remember who you've always been, before molding yourself to fit, before hiding to be accepted. The world doesn't need perfect versions. It needs whole people, of conscious human beings, who have the courage to look inside, face their own abysses, and even so, choose to act responsibly, ethically, with presence. If you've made it this far, you've already begun this transformation. It has already taken steps that most do not even dare to consider. And that, in itself, is already great. But remember, knowledge only turns into wisdom when it is lived. So, more than understanding all this intellectually, allow yourself to practice. Start small. Watch their reactions. Question your judgments. Recognize your patterns. And most of all, be kind to yourself in the process. The journey of the shadow is not a straight line. It's a dive. But every time you dive, you come back with something valuable. With more clarity, more maturity, more presence. And little by little, his life is no longer led by what is hidden, and it is guided by what is conscious. This is Jung's legacy. And that can also be your legacy, to live with authenticity, integrity, and courage, even in the face of your own darkness. Now take a deep breath. Look inside, and choose the next step. Because the shadow in you, she just wants to be seen.